My friend Wes and I have this tradition of going camping at least once a year. We're both from LA, and over the years we've camped in Arizona, Nevada, and closer spots like Joshua Tree. Every trip's been a blast, leaving us with loads of new memories and shared jokes. So when I suggested a weekend trip from Thursday night to Sunday at Monument Valley, Utah, he was all in and we were pumped. Our very first road trip was to the Grand Canyon. We tried to reach Monument Valley back then, but a snowstorm trapped us. Ever since, I'd wanted to visit. By Thursday night, we were packed up and ready for a 10-hour drive through the desert. Wes took the wheel for the first several hours since I'd stayed up the night before getting things ready and working a long shift. When we reached Barstow, we decided to take a detour. We'd heard about an old ghost town nearby where we thought we could snap some cool nighttime shots. The road to the ghost town was pitch black and super rough. It was around 1 a.m., and I was on edge, watching out the window. You never know what you might run into in the desert at that hour. At one point, I saw a huge 20-foot-tall dark figure in the shape of a person, and it nearly scared me out of my skin. But as we got closer, we saw it was just a massive sign shaped like an old prospector promoting the ghost town. Crisis averted. We also found an abandoned water park not far from there, but decided to steer clear when we noticed some flashlights in the distance. After that, we got back on the road, passing through Vegas around 3:30 a.m. It was eerie how empty and lifeless the city felt in those early hours. I took over driving from there, and the rest of the trip went smoothly. We drove through a place called Colorado City and noticed a lot of empty houses. We were curious and thought about exploring, but we had to keep moving. Later, we learned the town was full of isolated communities with a reputation for being wary of outsiders. Eventually, after a full day of driving and sightseeing, we rolled into Monument Valley around 8 p.m., totally beat. We set up camp and had dinner in the dark since we hadn't eaten much all day. After a few drinks, we took out our cameras for some stargazing photos. Being on Navajo land, I figured I'd push my luck a bit and asked Wes if he'd ever heard of the Navajo legend of the Skinwalker. He hadn't, so I explained it's a kind of Navajo shaman who can change shape to mimic animals or people, sometimes to lure them in. So, how do you know one if you see it? Wes asked. I explained that they look somewhat like animals, but something's always off, like how they move. One clear sign is they have no tail. The Navajo don't even mention skinwalkers, afraid of drawing them close. I then shared a few stories I'd read online about bizarre things people had experienced. One story was about a Navajo guy shooting with his cousins near some ruins. He'd heard odd animal sounds and ended up seeing a tailless black dog baring its teeth. We sat quietly in the freezing night air, listening. A faint breeze came, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. We waited, half expecting something strange, but nothing happened. Probably a camper's dog, I shrugged. I realized I'd left my camera shutter remote in the car, so I told Wes I'd be right back. The car wasn't far, but still a bit out of earshot. While rummaging in the car, I thought I heard my name faintly. I stopped, listened, and heard nothing, figuring I'd imagined it. But just as I found my remote, I heard Wes calling, sounding anxious. I closed the car and hurried back, thinking he'd spotted a snake or something. But when I got back, a black dog was standing there in front of us. We glanced at each other, waiting for one of us to act. Then I noticed and whispered, "Look, it doesn't have a tail." I grabbed a hatchet, ready to defend us, but the dog just acted like any regular dog, wandering around. We both let out a breath of relief. "What happened after I left?" I asked. Wes explained he'd been adjusting his camera when he noticed a dark shape in the shadows. Then he heard a strange licking sound below him, and there was this black dog staring back at him, which is when he called my name. Since the dog seemed harmless, we let it stay with us. It even kept us company the rest of the night, and we decided to call it Skinwalker, as if daring fate. Later, we called it a night and crawled into our tent. the dog curled up in a nearby bush to sleep. Nothing strange happened the next day, though we saw Skinwalker again in the morning, wandering around other campsites with another dog. In the daylight, we noticed his face looked a bit unusual, but he seemed like any other stray. On Sunday morning, something odd happened again, but it might just be a coincidence. We heard coyotes howling in the distance, but other than that, everything was calm. So, I don't know if we had a real Skinwalker encounter, but it was an odd experience we can share with family and friends. My brother Leon and I went camping a couple of summers back. We had always loved nature, though neither of us was especially experienced at it. Living in the city, we'd make it a goal to go on a camping trip once or twice each year. Not in places too secluded, but far enough that there weren't parking lots or public restrooms nearby. This time, we picked a location on public land known for its scenic views. Our plan was to stay there for 4 nights, staying in one place to keep things relaxing rather than adventurous. On a Thursday morning, I picked Leon up from his place. We packed the car with all the supplies he had gathered, then started our drive. We reached the parking spot by around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, then set out on the trail. It was about a 3-hour hike, so we wanted to get moving quickly. Just before dusk, we found our first camp spot. A great clearing with a pre-made fire pit and some big logs around it to use as seating. We set up the tent and got a fire going. The next day, we relaxed around camp, chatting and cooking our food over the fire, then spent the evening talking and looking up at the stars. The second day started out just as well. After breakfast, we noticed we were low on firewood. The area near our campsite was pretty much picked clean. It had been slim pickings when we got there, and now it seemed like there was no wood left at all. Leon offered to go look for more firewood while I stayed back to tidy up. I wasn't worried about him. He was quite competent outdoors and generally cautious. But after some time passed, I began to worry. Leon had been gone for over an hour, which seemed like too long. He hadn't said how long he'd be, but an hour felt excessive. I tried to stay calm, thinking he might have just gone farther out to find better wood. However, when another half hour passed and he still wasn't back, I knew something was wrong. I grabbed our rifle, which we'd brought for wildlife protection, and set off to look for him. I retraced the trail we'd walked the day before, scanning for signs of him. I could tell which way he'd started, but since I'm not much of a tracker, I mostly wandered around hoping to catch some clue. There were footprints here and there, but I couldn't tell if they were ours from when we'd first hiked in. After about 20 minutes, I came across fresh tire tracks, probably from a dirt bike or some sort of four-wheeler. That was strange, since neither of us had one, and we hadn't seen anyone else since arriving. I followed the tire tracks, hoping they might lead me to Leon. After another half hour of walking, I came upon a small clearing where I saw 3 men standing around. Leon was sitting at the base of a tree, clearly hurt. His face was bruised, and he looked out of it. The men hadn't noticed me because I was hiding behind a tree and some bushes. I stayed hidden, trying to figure out what to do. There was no way to get help. My phone had no service out there, and even if we tried to find someone, it would take hours, maybe even a whole day. We were outnumbered, and I didn't know if they were armed. With no better option, I fired a shot into the air, hoping to scare them off. Usually, I wouldn't fire a warning shot, but this situation called for something drastic. The 3 men jumped, looking around, and I yelled something along the lines of, "Get lost," and threatened to shoot again. Moments later, they took off. I waited a minute or two, then rushed over to Leon. "Are you okay?" I asked, helping him to stand. He was shaken but nodded. "Yeah, I think so. They caught me off guard," he said. We knew our best bet was to get out of there as quickly as possible. We returned to the campsite, grabbed a few essentials, some water, a bit of food, our wallets and car keys, then started hiking back to the car. I kept glancing over my shoulder the entire way, afraid they might follow us. When we finally reached the car, it was a massive relief. We drove straight to the nearest ranger station, though no one was there. We found a phone number on one of the signs and immediately called to report what had happened to Leon. I spoke with someone from the ranger's office, but as far as I know, they never tracked down those men. To this day, we can't figure out what those men wanted. We didn't have anything valuable with us, and it's unlikely they thought we did. Our gear might have been worth around $1,000 new, but used it was maybe worth a couple of hundred. We confirmed later that we hadn't accidentally wandered onto private land. The whole area was indeed public, so there was no reason for them to go after Leon like that. I still can't explain it, but I think Leon would have been in real trouble if I hadn't found him when I did. A friend of mine, let's call him Jake, and I used to take camping trips once or twice a year. Back when we were college roommates, we went out more often, but now we're both working full-time, so it's tougher to find the time. Jake was actually the one who got me into camping. He'd been doing it his whole life, while I had never even gone camping until I met him. This story happened around 2 years ago on one of our summer trips. We didn't venture far. We followed a trail, walked a couple of hours, and then set up our tents. The goal was more to enjoy camping than to do any serious hiking, so we usually stayed out for about 4 or 5 days. When we found a good spot, we got everything set up and just relaxed. For the next 3 days, we did the usual, sitting by the campfire, having some drinks and talking. We went on a few short walks and played some board games, but mostly just unwound. That was the whole reason for the trip anyway. On the 4th day, we decided it was time to pack up and head back the next morning. As the sun started to go down, we prepared to light the campfire one last time. Jake said he'd take a short walk to gather some dry wood and asked me to get the food out and ready to cook. I got everything prepared, but as the sky grew darker, Jake still hadn't returned. About 30 minutes had passed. It wasn't that long for a walk, but too long just to collect firewood. I figured maybe he had decided to go for a longer walk than he'd mentioned. Another 30 minutes went by. The sun was completely down, and darkness was setting in fast. I turned on our strong camping lamp, but I knew it wouldn't last long if left on. I started feeling really uneasy about Jake not being back. He was the camping expert between us, so getting lost didn't make sense. I thought it would be smart to start the fire anyway, just in case he was nearby and could see it to find his way back. I grabbed the lamp, gathered some sticks, and used a few matches to get the fire going. After 2 hours, I was starting to panic. I couldn't decide what to do. Should I search for him, head back and try to get help, or just stay put? My mind was racing through different possibilities. What if he was injured and close by? But if he was far away, I'd only risk getting lost myself. 2.5 hours after Jake had left, and 2 hours after night had fully set in, I heard a gunshot in the distance, roughly in the direction Jake had gone. What scared me most was that neither of us had brought a gun. I paced around our campsite, trying to decide what to do, before grabbing the lamp and heading out to look for him. Soon, I heard the sound of someone running toward me. I held up the lamp, my hand shaking, but it only lit a short distance ahead. I saw a figure coming closer. It was Jake. He looked terrified, his eyes wide and face pale. I'd never seen him look that frightened before. In a low, urgent voice, he told me we had to leave immediately. We dashed back to the campsite, grabbed our bags, and left everything else behind. I asked him what had happened, but he wouldn't explain until we were out of the woods. Once we made it out, he told me someone else was there, someone who had confronted him during his walk and held him at gunpoint, making him stay quiet and follow them somewhere. Before they reached wherever that was, Jake managed to escape, and that's when he found me. That's all he's ever told me, no matter how many times I've asked. I know he's purposely leaving out some details, but he just won't share them. One thing he's never mentioned is the gunshot I heard. My guess is that Jake, who's more than capable, may have overpowered the person. Maybe he got hold of the gun and did what he had to in order to get away, which might explain his shock and why the person didn't come after him. Whatever happened out there, Jake hasn't wanted to go camping since, and honestly, I feel the same. I just wish I knew the full truth about that night. I graduated college a couple of years before this happened. My best friend at the time was Ben, always up for an adventure, whether it was a hike or a last-minute road trip. After college, he moved to a mountain town, landing a job with a nature tour company. It wasn't exactly what he studied for, but it was a choice he made. Part of me was a bit envious as I sat in my office in the city. I had planned to visit him for my summer break, and he, being an outdoorsy guy, had organized a camping trip for us. It was just what I needed. He was thrilled to show me around his new area, knowing all the secret spots that wouldn't be on any map. Ben planned a 2-day camping trip to a secluded spot known only by locals and serious hikers. When I arrived at his place, we stayed up talking for a bit, but then went to bed around 10 p.m. so we could start early. We packed up the car with 2 large backpacks, a 3-person tent, a camping stove, cookware, food, water, and some clothes. We planned to sleep right on the ground to save room since it was warm enough to do so. Ben drove while I kept track of the GPS on his phone. The road was a narrow forest path that didn't seem to get much use. Every so often, we had to clear branches or logs to pass. Eventually, Ben stopped at what seemed like a random spot, turned off the car and said, "This is it." I couldn't see any trail, but I followed him. By 3 p.m., we were on our way, with plenty of daylight left. Not much happened the first night. We set up camp as the sun went down and got a fire going. The next morning, we packed up and kept hiking. It was late by the time we found our next spot, but we managed to get another fire going. This time, we stayed up a bit later. Around midnight, with the campfire just embers, Ben and I fell asleep in the tent. At around 2 a.m., I woke up needing to go to the bathroom. I unzipped the tent quietly, trying not to wake him, and walked a bit into the woods. It was pitch dark, and I didn't have a light. The moon's faint glow was barely enough to see. Just as I was finishing up, I noticed a distant light moving like a flashlight bobbing, as if someone were walking with it. I squinted to make sure I wasn't seeing things. Who else would be out there in the middle of the night in such a remote place? Curious and a bit on edge, I decided to watch from behind some trees. The light kept moving, getting closer. Then I heard whispering. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like 2 or more people. They seemed to be heading straight toward our campsite. I thought about waking Ben, but didn't want to make a sound. The whispering grew louder, and the light was close enough to cast shadows over our camp. I could see 2 figures moving cautiously toward our tent. Worried for my friend inside, I acted without thinking. I grabbed a rock and threw it in their direction, and it landed with a dull thud, possibly hitting one of them. The noise must have woken Ben because I heard him stir inside the tent. I called out, "Ben, get the gun." Even though we didn't have one, I just didn't know what else to do. The figures shone their flashlight in my direction, but I was hidden behind the trees. They didn't wait around to check and ran off into the night. I rushed back to the tent, where Ben grabbed his flashlight, and we both scanned the area, but we didn't see anyone. We checked our belongings, and nothing seemed to be missing. Neither of us could sleep, so we kept the fire going and stayed up the rest of the night, talking about what had happened. The next morning, we packed up and hiked back. Once we were back in town, we reported it to the police, but without descriptions or any evidence, there wasn't much they could do. I stayed a few more days with Ben, and all we could talk about was that night in the woods. We speculated on who those people might have been and what they were after, but we never got answers. It was just pure luck that I happened to be awake when they came. Whatever they wanted, we wouldn't have been able to stop them. When I was younger, my dad would take me camping at least once a year. My parents had split up before I could remember, and my dad lived in a small mountain town a few hours away. When I was little, we stuck to the easier trails, but as I got older, I wanted to try more adventurous routes. Unfortunately, my dad's health declined around the time I was in high school, so he couldn't join me on overnight hikes anymore. During visits, I started doing shorter hikes on my own, usually just 2 nights, so I'd still have time to visit him afterward. One summer, I chose a trail near my dad's place that we'd often talked about exploring together. I was excited as I prepared, thinking about all the times we'd camped together. It was during my summer break between my sophomore and junior years of college, and I was spending August with him. I just finished a summer job at the start of the month, so I had the rest of the time free to visit family. I borrowed my dad's truck and headed out to the trail alone. When I arrived, there was only one other car in the small parking area. This was one of the more isolated trails around, so it didn't attract many people. I parked a bit down from the other vehicle and began unloading my gear. There wasn't a visitor center, just a dirt lot and a sign marking the trail start. As I approached the path, I noticed the car's back door was slightly open, which caught my eye. Curious, I glanced inside and saw a large camping bag, making me think the person hadn't started their hike yet. I wondered if they were nearby, maybe taking a break. I looked around but saw no one, just the quiet woods and the empty road. I thought about waiting, but then decided it wasn't my business and set off on the trail. After about an hour of hiking, I hadn't seen another person, nor any fresh footprints. Seemed like I was out there alone. By nightfall, I found a good campsite and set up for the night. It was a designated spot, big enough for several tents, but I was the only one there. As the sun set, I cooked a simple dinner and sat by my small fire. With nothing much else to do, I went to bed not long after dusk, lying awake for a couple of hours, just listening to the forest sounds. In the morning, I woke up to the sound of an engine, which was odd since the trail didn't allow vehicle access. When I peeked outside my tent, I saw what looked like a park ranger coming my way. I got up to meet him. "Good morning," he said. "Sorry to bother you, but we've got a situation. There's a missing person in the area, and we're evacuating the trail to investigate." His words took a moment to sink in, and my mind went straight to the car I'd seen at the trailhead with the camping bag inside. When he asked if I'd seen anything unusual, I mentioned the car but hadn't noticed anything else. He nodded and made a note in his book. "We're asking everyone to pack up and head back so we can keep the area clear for search teams," he added. I returned to my tent, quickly gathered my things, and started back down the trail. I felt a bit nervous, wondering if there might be some danger out there. But after about an hour, I saw 2 more rangers on ATVs, which reassured me. I figured if anyone was lurking around, they'd be avoiding the rangers. When I got back to the trailhead, there were more vehicles there, police officers, additional rangers, and some search equipment. The car I'd noticed earlier was now blocked off by a police barricade. I briefly spoke with one of the officers, explaining that I hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. I left feeling uneasy, wishing there was something more I could do to help. Over the next few days, I kept an eye on the news, hoping for good news. But the missing person was never found, and it became a big mystery in the community. People speculated about what could have happened, but no one had any answers. From what I've heard, authorities suspected foul play. I doubt anything or anyone dangerous was lurking out there while I was hiking, but I guess it's possible. Since then, I've continued hiking but never go alone anymore. Luckily, my dad's health has improved, and we can camp together again, although we stick to spots accessible by car now, which I'm more than okay with. This unsettling experience happened to me and a group of my friends a few summers ago. It was me, Mike, Jay, and Charlie. Jay and Mike had also brought their girlfriends along, so there were 6 of us all together. Our destination was a secluded area in a state forest not far from where we lived. The site was part of a campground surrounded by thick woods. I had visited before and barely saw another person during my previous trip. We took 2 cars and parked near the visitor center before setting off on foot. Each of us carried a big backpack with personal items and some food. The trail took us through tall trees and winding streams, creating a beautiful view. I hadn't left town for a while, so I was excited to finally get outdoors again. I almost forgot how much I enjoyed being in nature. After about 2 hours of hiking, we found the ideal campsite. A quiet, open spot surrounded by dense trees. The trees around the area created a natural barrier, making it tough to go far without getting tangled up in branches. It was the same spot I had camped at last time, probably the first decent site along the trail, and it suited us just fine. We set up our tents even though it was only around 2 p.m., with plenty of daylight left. Once we were settled, we explored the area. I knew of a lake nearby, so we went for a swim and enjoyed a few drinks. The day was fantastic. As the sun started to set, we returned to our campsite and started a fire. Jay had brought dinner for the first night, just hot dogs, which was typical of him, not putting in much effort. We roasted the hot dogs over the fire and swapped stories. Before long, it was around 1 a.m. I was the first to head to bed, but the others followed shortly after. I had my own tent, a small 2-person tent. The couples shared one tent, and Charlie had his own as well. In the stillness of the night, I heard faint sounds coming from the trees. It sounded like someone walking, but didn't seem like an animal. It had to be a person. I wasn't too worried, thinking it was probably one of my friends heading out to use the bathroom. Just as I was about to drift off, I was jolted by a scream. At first, I thought it was one of the girls, but after listening more closely, I realized it was Jay. I unzipped my tent and peeked out into the darkness. What I saw next stopped me in my tracks. A dark figure stood by Jay's tent. I knew it wasn't one of my friends since the shape didn't match any of them. This figure was tall, easily over 6 feet, with long hair and a trench coat. I couldn't make out much else in the shadows. I called out, hoping to scare off whoever it was and protect my friends. But when the figure turned toward me, I could only see a tall shadow, blanketed in darkness. I did catch a glimpse of something that looked like a knife in his right hand. Before I could react, a loud bang echoed through the night. Charlie, always quick on his feet, had fired his gun into the air. In the confusion, the figure melted back into the trees and disappeared. We all sat there, stunned and looking at each other in confusion. There was no way any of us were going back to sleep after that. I rekindled the fire, and we huddled around it, discussing what had happened. I thought it was just a man, but Jay insisted it was some kind of creature. Charlie suggested it might have been a werewolf or something, but I'd seen it the clearest, and I was sure they were letting their imaginations run wild. When morning came, I noticed a huge cut in Jay's tent, a big gash that I hadn't spotted in the dark. The figure had slashed it open. We quickly packed up and hiked back to the main road. We reported the incident to a park ranger, who mentioned that other campers had reported strange encounters in the same area. I gave him a sarcastic thanks for the warning, though he deserved worse. When I was around 12, I went to a summer camp a few hours from my town. It was my first time there, but one of my closest friends, Tom, had been going every summer. A few other boys from school also went, but Tom was the only one I really knew well. When we arrived, Tom told me about an old cabin hidden in the woods nearby. He said it was deserted and we should check it out. It sounded exciting and a bit creepy, but we decided to go for it. Tom mentioned that he and some other guys had explored it the previous summer, but they got too scared and left before seeing everything. This time, Tom wanted to go all the way in. We planned to go one night after everyone at camp had fallen asleep. We grabbed a couple of flashlights, put on our sneakers, and waited for the right moment. Once everything was silent, we slipped out of our bunks and headed into the woods. Walking through the forest at night felt eerie. It was dark except for our flashlights, and every sound seemed louder. We kept walking, searching for the cabin, but it was harder to find than we expected. Tom led the way since he had been there before, but it seemed like he had forgotten exactly where it was. Finally, after what seemed like forever, we spotted it. The cabin looked old and abandoned, as if no one had been there for years. It was exciting to finally find it, but also spooky. We circled the outside first. It was a weathered log cabin, like something from an old story. The place was falling apart. There was no glass in the windows, the wood was decayed, and some parts of the metal roof were missing. The front door was also gone. We went inside to explore. The place was dusty and filthy, and it felt like a big adventure to us as kids. There were a few rooms even though it was small. We were standing in the living room but could see a kitchen in the back and a door that likely led to a bedroom. After a few minutes of checking out the living room and kitchen, we heard a noise that seemed to come from the bedroom. We froze and listened. It sounded like a floor creaking, but neither of us had moved. I was scared and wanted to leave, but Tom wanted to investigate. Not wanting to look like a wimp, I pushed down my fear. We slowly approached the door. Tom reached for the knob and started to open it. Just as he had it open about a third of the way, an arm shot out and slammed the door shut from inside. Someone was in there. We both freaked out. We didn't know who it was or what he was doing there. Without a second thought, we turned and sprinted back to camp as fast as we could. We didn't stop or look back until we were safely back in our bunks. We decided not to tell anyone, worried we'd get in trouble for sneaking out. Looking back, I'm not sure if we were really in danger. It seemed like whoever was inside just wanted to be left alone. Still, it's unsettling to think that someone, maybe a homeless person, had taken up residence in an old cabin near a popular summer camp. I walked by the cabin again during the day but didn't go in. Just as I was about to turn away, I saw a shadow pass across the front window. It was just a faint figure, but I was certain I saw it. We never did find out who was inside. When I was around 10, my family and I went camping together. We drove to a state park that was a few hours away from home. It wasn't a very remote place. Probably wouldn't have been easy to do serious camping with young kids anyway. Really, it was more like a vacation just with tents. Our campsite was even accessible by car, so that gives you an idea of the setup. We left early in the morning, my mom, my brother, and my sister. My brother was a year older than me, and my sister was a couple of years younger. The three of them shared a large tent, and I had one of my own. When we arrived, I noticed a group of guys at the site next to ours. They looked like they were around college age, maybe in their early 20s, and there were 4 of them. I remember them being loud, annoying, and not very considerate of the quiet atmosphere of the campground. Once we set up our tents, we went for a walk around the area. When we got back, the guys were sitting around, drinking and talking loudly. They were swearing a lot. Not that it bothered me, but my mom didn't appreciate it. As the evening wore on, they seemed to be getting angry with each other. I couldn't figure out what was going on, and honestly, I didn't care much. It was hard to sleep, but eventually, I managed to get a few hours of rest. The next morning, when we woke up, the men were passed out. One of them was sprawled out near the fire pit, and another had his boots sticking out of a tent. They were a total mess. My mom warned me to keep my distance. She had a feeling something was off with them. I followed her advice, though I was a bit curious. Then, I noticed something that made me uneasy. There was a large hunting knife stuck in the wooden picnic table at their site. There didn't seem to be any good reason to have a knife like that out, but I didn't worry too much. I even thought it looked kind of cool. My mom, on the other hand, was clearly worried. When the second night came, their behavior only got worse. They were shouting louder, and I could hear anger and tension in their voices. It seemed like there was some bad blood between at least a couple of them. The atmosphere was uncomfortable, to say the least. Out of nowhere, I heard what sounded like a gunshot. I froze, trying to process what had just happened. I could feel it in my chest, an intense, startling feeling. At first, I thought it might have been firecrackers, but when the park ranger arrived, I realized it was a gunshot. The ranger went over to their campsite and had a serious talk with the man who seemed to be the one responsible. Their voices were firm, and it soon became clear that one of them had fired a weapon, putting everyone nearby at risk. My mom told me to stay where I was. I wanted to join them in the main tent, but she insisted I stay put. We listened as more officers arrived, and I could see their flashing lights through the fabric of my tent. The guys sounded drunk, though they cooperated with the police. Eventually, they were led away. The next morning, their site was completely cleared out. A little while later, the ranger came by and told us we had to leave as well. We didn't argue and packed up quickly. Despite the bad experience, we returned to the same campground several times in the years after that. Nothing like this ever happened again. I never found out what became of those guys. I'm pretty sure the one who fired the gun faced consequences. Luckily, no one got hurt, but it was definitely against the rules to even have a gun there, especially since they were drinking. This took place last year. I went hiking with my younger brother, Mike. It was a warm weekend in early fall, late September. The place we picked was crowded during summer, but it quieted down a lot as autumn set in. I'd been there before, but Mike hadn't. He didn't have much outdoor experience, while I'd gone on a good number of challenging trips. We packed up our camping stuff, loaded the truck, and headed out. There was a parking lot and a small ranger post with a gift shop at the entrance. A few other cars were parked, so we thought there might be other hikers around. There weren't any assigned campsites. You just hiked in and set up camp wherever you found an open spot. If a space was empty, it was fair game. We set off early in the afternoon and hiked for about 4 hours. Our first spot was right by a lake, with plenty of space for our tent and a fire pit already set up. We looked around for firewood, but the area was pretty picked over. We only managed to gather a few small sticks, not enough for a decent fire. We figured we'd find more wood as we went farther. We went to bed early that night, but I lay awake for a while. We were sleeping directly on the ground to keep our packs lighter, which wasn't very comfortable. During the night, I heard some noises. Most of them were from deer, but I also heard an animal sound that I was pretty sure came from a bear. It was easy to tell the difference. I knew there were bears in the area, so we had taken the right steps. Our food was hung high in a tree, so I wasn't too worried. There was nothing in the tent to attract wildlife. The next morning, we packed up early and hit the trail again. Around noon, Mike noticed something strange. A backpack left on the ground just a bit off the trail, maybe 20 feet away. It was bright blue, so it was easy to spot against the grass. We cautiously walked closer to take a look. When I examined it, my heart skipped a beat. The backpack had deep claw marks on it, clearly left by a bear. We knew the risks of hiking here, but seeing this was a reminder of the real danger. We were afraid there had been a bear attack. I crouched down to look closer at the bag, hoping to find something with the owner's info so the rescue team would know who to look for. Then, I noticed there was blood on the bag, and it was still fresh. That was enough for us. We backed away and turned around. Our trip was over. There was someone hurt out there, and a bear that might be more dangerous than usual. Mike was more shaken than I was, but I was scared, too. We hiked out as fast as we could. It had taken us about 6 or 7 hours to get in, and it took us less than 5 to get out. The sun was setting as we reached the ranger station, and we quickly reported what we found. Search teams were sent out that night, but they didn't find anything. A few days later, we heard news that another hiker who had been on the same trail had gone missing. The signs pointed to a terrible possibility that the bear might have crossed paths with this unfortunate person. For the next several days, searchers combed through the forest, looking everywhere for any sign of the missing hiker. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, hope began to fade. The hiker was never found. This was big news in our area because animal attacks like this are extremely rare. I haven't heard of another incident like it since. I still enjoy the outdoors, but after this, Mike said he'd never come along with me again. He took it hard, and I understand why. I go on a lot of quick camping trips throughout the year. I try to keep them under 3 days so I can go over a weekend and only miss a day or two of work. This was just another trip I had planned to take one weekend in mid-April. My idea was to hike about 5 hours to reach a small lake, set up my camp next to it, stay a couple of nights, and then head back. On the morning of the trip, I drove out and started my hike at around 8 a.m. There weren't any trails leading to this lake, which is one reason I picked it as my spot. Since it was only about a 5-hour hike, I wasn't too worried about losing my way, and I'd also avoid crowds of other campers. About 4 hours in, I thought I caught sight of someone. I was spacing out when I noticed something moving quickly in the distance. I froze, looking around to see who or what it was, but nothing else moved. Since I hadn't been staring right at it when it happened, I couldn't be certain I'd seen a person, but I was a bit more alert for the last hour of my hike. When I reached the lake, I was blown away by how beautiful it was. A perfect spot to rest. I didn't take long to pick a place to set up my camp, finding a spot tucked among the trees by the lake's edge. Almost as soon as I got settled, though, I noticed someone across the lake, walking by the trees. They didn't have any gear, just walking aimlessly. I looked around to see if they had a camp nearby, but there was nothing. After a minute, they stepped into the woods and disappeared. This left me feeling a bit on edge, realizing someone else was out there by this remote lake. It made me wonder if I really had seen someone while I was hiking. I decided to stay at my campsite for the rest of the evening. When night came, I started a small fire, trying to keep it low-key so it wouldn't draw attention. It had been nearly 4 hours since I'd seen the person, but I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. I warmed up some food, ate, and took out a book to pass time, but I kept feeling like someone was watching me. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks because of what happened earlier, but after a few minutes, I couldn't focus on reading. I put the book down, packed up my things, and got ready for bed. Before putting out the fire, I did one last scan around me. About 15 yards away, I saw someone standing. It was dark, but I could tell they were watching me. They stood perfectly still, just staring, and I stared back. We stayed like that for a whole minute until they began to back up, still facing me, moving into the trees until they disappeared into the dark. I was shaking with fear. What were they doing out here, and would they come back? I made my fire bigger and stayed up the entire night. When dawn finally came, I packed up quickly and left, not wanting to stay even a second longer. As I hiked back, I swear I heard faint footsteps behind me a few times. Even now, when I think about it, I feel that same fear. I don't know who that person was, why they were there, or what they wanted. But based on how they seemed to be following me, I don't think their intentions were good. I'm almost certain that if I'd stayed another night or gone to sleep, I might not have made it back.